In modern New York, you can walk through Lower Manhattan and never guess what used to stand beneath the glass and traffic. But in the mid-1800s, this was the city's pressure point, an intersection of poverty, immigration, and politics so intense that violence didn't just happen here, it organized. This is the real story behind the gangs of New York. Not one duel, not one villain, but an entire ecosystem. Street crews, firehouse toughs, election muscle, and neighborhood identities that turned a few blocks into a battlefield. And it all begins in a place called 5 Points. To understand the gangs, you have to understand the neighborhood that produced them. 5 Points wasn't born as a glamorous district that fell. It formed where fast growth collided with bad infrastructure and hard economics. Early New York expanded quickly, and parts of Lower Manhattan sat on land that had been filled, leveled, and built over in ways that did not always drain well. Damp cellars, muddy yards, and poor sanitation became normal. In a time before modern public health, that mattered. Crowded housing plus filth meant disease spread easily, and life was cheap, especially for the poor. By the 1840s and 1850s, 5 Points gained a reputation as one of the most notorious slum zones in America. But it wasn't just crime, it was density, desperation, and constant competition. Work was unstable, wages were low, a single injury could ruin a family. And the streets became the place where disputes were settled in public because many people had little faith that institutions would protect them. Then immigration intensified everything. Large numbers of Irish immigrants arrived in New York in the middle of the century, many fleeing famine and grinding poverty. They came seeking survival, not comfort, and 5 Points, cheap, central, already crowded, became a landing zone. That created a combustible mix. Newcomers competing with earlier residents for the same jobs and rooms, religious differences layered over class resentment, and neighborhoods turning into identity markers, us versus them. When people hear the word gang, they often picture a modern criminal organization, hierarchies, business models, long-term rackets. 5 Points gangs were different. They were street-based groups tied to a few blocks, a tavern, a fire company, or a local social network. Think of them as neighborhood crews with a shared reputation, sometimes a name, sometimes a symbol, sometimes just a fear people felt when they saw them coming. They fought for territory, status, and survival. They robbed, they threatened, they brawled. But they also served a social function: protection, belonging, and backup in a city where a poor newcomer could be exploited by almost anyone. If you had no money, no influence, and no stable job, the street group could become your insurance policy. The most important twist is that gangs did not live separately from politics. In this era, elections were not calm civic days. They were street events. Crowds gathered, tensions rose, ballot boxes could be stolen, voters could be intimidated. Political factions needed muscle, people who could hold a corner, escort supporters to vote, or scare rivals away from polling places. Street crews became valuable, and local political operators often treated them as assets. So the gangs were both criminals and political tools. That's why the story matters. 5 Points isn't only a crime story, it's an origin story for modern urban power, where the line between public life and street force could blur in broad daylight. By the mid-19th century, New York had multiple worlds stacked on top of each other. Respectable merchants and politicians above, and a dense working-class underworld below. In that underworld, ethnic identity often shaped alliances. Nativist street groups, hostile to immigrants, especially Irish Catholics, gained influence in some areas. Immigrant-heavy neighborhoods formed their own crews in response. This is the stage where groups like the Bowery Boys enter the story, part street fighters, part neighborhood identity, and part political presence. Across town, 5 Points crews developed their own reputations, building toward the clashes that would explode into open riots. To make sense of gang conflict in this era, it helps to drop the idea that every fight was just about money. In mid-19th century New York, street identity often meant ethnicity, religion, and the feeling that the city was being taken from you. The Bowery Boys became one of the most famous native gangs. They were associated with the Bowery area and known for a rough, confrontational style. In popular memory, they're linked to nativism, hostility toward immigrants, especially Irish Catholics, and a kind of street patriotism. We belong here, they don't. They weren't a single uniform army, and their membership and alliances could shift. But their image was consistent, a visible street force, proud, loud, and ready to fight. A crucial detail for your video: gangs like this didn't operate in a vacuum. They had meeting places, taverns, corners, sometimes firehouses. They had local allies, and they had opponents who were just as organized on the other side of the social divide. Across town, 5 Points produced its own street groups. Many were rooted in immigrant life, especially Irish communities that were crowded into the lowest rent housing. Some members were young men with few options and plenty of anger. Some were older and more experienced, connected to local toughs who had learned how to navigate the city's informal economy. Why join a street crew at all? Because the streets could swallow you if you were alone. A gang could offer protection from harassment, a way to fight back against rival neighborhoods, and a reputation that discouraged people from targeting you. It could also offer opportunity: petty theft, intimidation jobs, guarding illegal gambling, or acting as muscle for someone who could pay. This is where you can add a grounded line that keeps it historical and not romantic. In 5 Points, a gang wasn't a fantasy. It was a response to instability: work instability, housing instability, and social instability. So what did day-to-day control look like? It wasn't constant war. Most days were about presence. Who owned the corner? Who could walk a street at night without being challenged? Which tavern was safe for which group? Which block would erupt if someone crossed it? When violence happened, it could be sudden and communal. A single insult, a stolen hat, a rumor, or a political argument could become a neighborhood event. Fights weren't always planned like a battle. They could snowball because crowds formed fast and loyalty pulled people in. Weapons were often simple: clubs, sticks, stones, knives, whatever was available. And because the city was dense, a small fight could pull in dozens within minutes. Now add the biggest accelerant: weak or inconsistent policing. Mid-century New York did not yet have the kind of stable, professional law enforcement you'd recognize today. Policing could be undermanned, it could be politically pressured, and public order could depend on which authority was present, which faction controlled a precinct, or whether officers felt safe stepping into a crowd. That inconsistency mattered because gangs thrived where enforcement was uncertain. If the state arrives late or arrives divided, the street learns it can rule in the meantime. By the mid-1850s, the ingredients were set: a notorious slum district packed tight with poverty and resentment. Rival street identities, one tied to nativism, the other tied to immigrant survival. Political incentives that rewarded intimidation and crowd control, and institutions that often struggled to respond quickly. In that atmosphere, large-scale violence wasn't surprising. It was almost inevitable. And in 1857, it happened. In early July 1857, New York hits a breaking point. What begins as gang conflict escalates into something bigger: a rolling street riot that lasts days, draws huge crowds, and makes whole blocks feel ungovernable. This event is widely remembered as the Dead Rabbits Riot. In the popular version, it sounds simple. One Irish gang versus their nativist rivals, fighting for 5 points like an open war. The reality is messier, and that mess is what makes it historically interesting. Because this wasn't a controlled duel. It was urban chaos, crowds forming fast, rumors spreading faster, retaliation multiplying, and bystanders getting pulled into violence whether they wanted to or not. In a dense neighborhood, fights don't stay small. The streets are narrow, homes are packed together, and people watch from windows, doorways, and rooftops. The moment a large group starts moving, it becomes a moving storm. If the police try to push in without enough numbers, they can be overwhelmed. If they hesitate, the crowd reads hesitation as weakness. For your narration, emphasize the scale and the feeling of a city losing control, not as movie spectacle, but as a real civic crisis. This is the kind of event that forces officials, newspapers, and ordinary residents to ask the same question. If this can happen here, what stops it from happening again? Here's a key point that makes your video stronger and more honest than most retellings. Historians debate how formal some of these gang names were and how much newspapers shaped the labels. In other words, the riot is real. The violence is real. Rival crews are real. But the name Dead Rabbits may have been amplified, maybe even partly invented as a neat headline that helped readers make sense of complicated street warfare. That doesn't mean the gang didn't exist in a simple way. It means the underworld was fluid. Crews split, merged, changed names, and were sometimes described differently depending on who was talking. Police, rivals, politicians, or journalists. So instead of promising viewers one clean faction, you can say something more accurate and more compelling. The riot became a symbol, and the symbol became a story. That story is what later generations remembered as the Dead Rabbits. Why did a street conflict grow into city-level disorder? Because 5 Points was under multiple pressures at once. Economic stress, unstable jobs, low wages, constant fear of falling into hunger. Identity conflict, native resentment versus immigrant survival. Religion and ethnicity sharpening every argument. Political opportunism. Street muscle was useful, so violence was sometimes tolerated until it became impossible to ignore. Institutional weakness. If enforcement is inconsistent, crowds learn they can take the street. Put these together and you get a predictable pattern. Small fight, crowd forms, rumors spread, rivals mobilize, retaliation, public, panic, heavy response. The riot wasn't just a gang story, it was a preview of what happens when a large city grows faster than its systems can handle. After a major riot, the underworld doesn't disappear overnight. It adapts. Street groups learn what the city will tolerate and where enforcement will land. Politicians learn which alliances are dangerous in public. Police and civic leaders face pressure to clean up, but cleanup in a crowded, poor district is never simple, because the conditions that produce violence don't vanish with arrests. So the late 1850s become a transition period. The gangs still exist, but the city's relationship with them starts to shift. And the next great rupture, bigger than any neighborhood feud, arrives with the Civil War era. By 1863, New York is no longer just arguing about neighborhoods. The nation is at war. The Civil War is grinding on, and the federal government introduces conscription. For many working-class New Yorkers, the draft feels like a punishment aimed downward. In the popular memory, the draft is simply unpopular. But the deeper reality is class anger. If you're poor, losing months of wages can destroy your family. If you're rich, you may have options. legal loopholes, influence, or the ability to absorb the cost. That sense of injustice becomes gasoline. When the draft riots begin, they don't stay as a protest. They explode into multi-day urban violence, attacks on police, destruction of property, and, most horrifying, racial terror directed at Black New Yorkers. The city's internal fractures are suddenly visible on every street. For your video, be clear about the connection to the gang era. The draft riots were not caused by gangs. But in a city already used to crowd violence, street intimidation, and factional politics, the jump from grievance to chaos happens fast. The underworld culture of physical power, who controls a block, who controls a crowd, becomes part of how disorder spreads. Events like the draft riots force institutions to respond. When disorder reaches this level, city leaders can't treat violence as local trouble. It becomes a threat to the city's legitimacy and to business stability. This is one of the reasons the old 5 Points gang ecosystem starts to weaken over time. Not instantly, but steadily. After major shocks, the pressure builds for stronger policing and clearer authority, more organized governance, and long-term reform projects aimed at reshaping the worst districts. At the same time, New York itself is changing. The city grows northward. New communities form. Old street rivalries don't vanish, but they become less central as the city expands and as new types of crime and organization emerge. So what actually ends the classic 5 Points gang era? It's not one final battle. It's the slow destruction of the environment that made it possible. Urban redevelopment and restructuring. As New York modernizes, blocks get rebuilt, streets are altered, and notorious slum areas are gradually targeted for change. When a neighborhood's geography changes, gang territory becomes harder to defend. Institutional evolution. Over time, the city's systems become more capable, more consistent policing, stronger administrative control, and less tolerance for open street warfare. Demographic movement. Immigrant communities don't stay frozen in one district forever. Families move, neighborhoods shift, and the social networks that fueled older crews break apart or relocate. Underworld transformation. Crime doesn't disappear, it evolves. Later groups tend to look less like street brawlers and more like organized rackets with quieter methods: bribery, structured extortion, and controlled vice economies. So 5 Points becomes something else, a story people tell about what New York used to be, when the street could openly fight for power in the middle of Manhattan. The real Gangs of New York story matters because it shows how a modern city is built, not only by architects and politicians, but by conflict. 5 Points was a warning sign. If housing is desperate, work is unstable, and people believe the system is unfair, then identity and violence fill the vacuum. And it's also a reminder that history isn't clean. The legend version gives you simple teams and a clear villain. The real version gives you causes: immigration pressure, class anger, political opportunism, and weak institutions, turning ordinary streets into a struggle for survival.